Jinnah of Pakistan by Stanley Wolpert. Chapter 13, Lahore to Delhi, 1940 to 1942. The historic Pakistan resolution was hammered into final form at Lahore after Quaid-e-Azam finished speaking. The League's Subjects Committee met to argue over their draft through the early hours of Saturday, March 23rd, and it was not until late afternoon that unanimity was reached. Sir Sikandar found the concept of partition insupportable till the bitter end, for it was at once a repudiation of his Unionist party's basic platform of Hindu-Muslim-Sikh coexistence and of his potential to win personal leadership over the League. After hearing how enthusiastically Jinnah's speech was received, however, Sikandar must have known that his days of aspiring to supreme leadership of the Muslims of India were numbered. Even in the heart of his home province that morning, an angry crowd of young Muslim League militants marched round the pandal, while the Subjects Committee met inside, shouting, "Sikandar Murdabad! Death to Sikandar!" Hearing that most popular curse connected to his own name in Lahore must have given him pause. When Jinnah appeared, however, the young men changed their cry to Quaid-e-Azam Zindabad. Whoever had trained and orchestrated that chorus had done an effective job. Jinnah presided over the second day's session of the Lahore League. Fazlul Haq, who chaired the Subjects Committee, moved the first resolution, the most famous third paragraph of which stated that it is the considered view of this session of the All India Muslim League that no constitutional plan would be workable in this country or acceptable to the Muslims unless it is designed on the following basic principles, viz., that geographically contiguous units are demarcated into regions which should be so constituted, with such territorial readjustments as may be necessary, that the areas in which the Muslims are numerically in a majority, as in the northwestern and eastern zones of India, should be grouped to constitute independent states in which the constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign. Pakistan was not explicitly mentioned, nor was it clear from the language of the resolution whether a single Muslim state of both zones had been envisioned or two separate autonomous independent states, one in the northwest and the other in the eastern Bangladesh zone. Sher-e-Bengal, Lion of Bengal, Fazlul Haq at least appears to have had the latter in mind when he drafted the resolution and read it aloud. But Jinnah was the leader, and when asked by reporters if this resolution meant one or more than one Muslim nation, his unequivocal answer sealed the fate of Bengal's Muslim majority. India's newspaper headlines next day pronounced the Lahore resolution a single Pakistan resolution, and so it remained. Sikandar held out for some form of federating central government to unite the sovereign constituent units and insisted till his death in December of 1942 that the Lahore resolution was only a bargaining point for the League. For Sikandar, indeed it was, but not for Jinnah. Punjab Governor Sir Henry Craik reported the resolution to Linlithgow as a very effective riposte to Congress as it torpedoed the Congress claim to speak for India. A few days later, Gandhi was asked, "Do you intend to start general civil disobedience?" Although Quaid-e-Azam, Jinnah has declared war against Hindus and has got the Muslim League to pass a resolution favoring vivisection of India into two. If you do, what becomes of your formula that there is no Swaraj without communal unity? To this he replied, "I admit that the step taken by the Muslim League at Lahore creates a baffling situation. But I do not regard it so baffling as to make disobedience an impossibility. The Muslims must have the same right of self-determination that the rest of India has. We are at present a joint family. Any member may claim a division. Other leaders of Congress reacted more strongly. I consider it a sign of a diseased mentality that Mr. Jinnah has brought himself to look upon the idea of one India as a misconception and the cause of most of our trouble, argued Chakravarti Rajgopalachari, 1879 to 1972, of Madras, who rose to become the first Indian Governor General. Nehru wrote of the resolution as Jinnah's fantastic proposals, reading it as a cat's paw of British imperial duplicity. At Ramgarh, Congress had resolved that India's constitution must be based on independence, democracy, and national unity, repudiating attempts to divide India or to split up her nationhood. Liaquat Ali Khan convened the third day's proceedings of the Lahore League shortly before, announcing that the Quaid-e-Azam would arrive a little late. Jinnah, though exhausted, managed to muster strength enough to appear inside the pandal shortly after the meeting commenced. He was in the chair, in fact, when Dr. Muhammad Alam, a recent convert to the League after having left Congress, seconded the resolution moved the day before. Resolution carried by acclamation. Another resolution asserting the League's grave concern at British inordinate delay in coming to a settlement with the Arabs in Palestine also carried that final day. The session then adjourned and was reconvened by Jinnah at 9 p.m. after he had had several hours' rest. He personally moved a resolution on behalf of the Khaksars, urging the Punjab government to remove the unlawful ban imposed on that militant Muslim organization and called for an impartial committee of inquiry to investigate the tragic clash between the Khaksars and the police of March 19th. Jinnah urged everyone to bring all the evidence to such an inquiry committee once it was appointed, adding, "The rest we will see, and God will help us." In winding up the session that night, Jinnah called it a landmark in the history of India and concluded that the more you organize yourself, the more you will be able to get your rights. The session ended just before midnight with shouts of Quaid-e-Azam Zindabad. The next day, before leaving Lahore, Jinnah told reporters, "I have thoroughly enjoyed my stay in Lahore because of the result. Otherwise, I was worked to death." Linlithgow wrote Jinnah in April, reassuring him that His Majesty's government are in friendly and sympathetic relations with all Muslim powers, to some of whom indeed they are bound by alliance. Wounded by gunfire in London's Caxton Hall a month before, triggered by a young Adam Singh, the Sikh assassin of Sir Michael O'Dwyer, Lord Zetland then opted for early retirement. The War Cabinet's new Secretary of State for India was L.S. Emery, 1873 to 1955, Prime Minister Churchill's predecessor as First Lord of the Admiralty. With Churchill and Emery at the helm in London, Jinnah's stock rose much higher in New Delhi and Simla. The Hindu's clever correspondent B. Shiva Rao reported from Simla in June on an outbreak of Jinnah complex which seems to obsess the official mind. No step can be taken, however reasonable, lest Mr. Jinnah should be offended. At this juncture, Sikandar tried his best to negotiate a federal scheme settlement with Congress, hoping to short-circuit Jinnah and working with Linlithgow's tactic support. The Viceroy sought a further round of discussions between Gandhi and Jinnah, but Jinnah was not eager to return to futile arguments and waited in any event till he had a chance to meet with his working committee and get them to arm him with the tougher set of demands. Gandhi wrote to Linlithgow offering to go to Germany or anywhere required to plead for peace, since, as he noted, I do not believe here Hitler to be as bad as he is portrayed. He might even have been a friendly power as he may still be. The Viceroy did not, however, accept that offer. Jinnah called his working committee to Bombay in mid-June, and after a stormy 3-day meeting at which Sikandar did his best to wrest leadership of the League for himself, they resolved first of all to endorse the Quaid-e-Azam's position as voiced in late May, reminding the British that up to the present moment, we have not created any difficulty, nor have we embarrassed the British government in the prosecution of the war. The League's High Command then looked with alarm at the growing menace of Nazi aggression, which has been most ruthlessly depriving one nation after another of its liberty and freedom, and regards the unprovoked attack by the Italian government against the Allies as most unwarranted and immoral at a time when France was engaged in a brave struggle against very heavy odds. Jinnah visited the Viceregal Palace at Simla on June 27, 1940, conferring at length with Linlithgow. Afterwards, he wrote a memo reaffirming that the Lahore, Pakistan resolution had become the universal faith of Muslim India, and that the Viceroy had promised him that no interim or final scheme of new constitution would be adopted by the British government without the previous approval of Muslim India. They had also agreed that everything should be done that is possible to intensify war efforts and mobilize all the resources of India for her defense for the purpose of maintaining internal security, peace, and tranquility, and to ward off external aggression. Jinnah insisted that this can only be achieved provided the British government are ready and willing to associate the Muslim leadership as equal partners in the government, both at the center and in all the provinces. Specifically, he recommended that for the duration of the war, the Executive Council of the Viceroy be expanded to include at least as many Muslim members as Hindus, if the Congress comes in. Otherwise, Muslims, all to be chosen by the League, were to have the majority of additional council membership. In mid-1940, with the Britain braced against German invasion and its populace desperately seeking to survive an endless monsoon of bombs, Jinnah wisely judged that the time was not ripe for a power struggle showdown with the British. Gandhi at this time published an open letter to every Briton urging cessation of hostilities. No cause, however just, can warrant the indiscriminate slaughter that is going on minute by minute. I do not want Britain to be defeated, nor do I want her to be victorious in a trial of brute strength. I want you to fight Nazism without arms. I would like you to lay down the arms you have as being useless for saving you or humanity. You will invite Hitler and Signor Mussolini to take what they want of the countries you call your possessions. Let them take possession of your beautiful island with your many beautiful buildings. You will give all these, but neither your souls nor your minds. If these gentlemen choose to occupy your homes, you will vacate them. If they do not give you free passage out, will allow yourself men, women, and children to be slaughtered, but on will refuse to owe allegiance to them. I am telling His Excellency the Viceroy that my services are at the disposal of His Majesty's government, should they consider them of any practical use in advancing the object of my appeal. The Viceroy did not, however, use the Mahatma's services in this regard, opting instead to follow Jinnah's advice by expanding his executive council to make it a more effective weapon of war. Jinnah convened his working committee in Bombay early that September. The committee reaffirmed the League's Pakistan demand and noted with satisfaction the Viceroy's clear assurance that no future constitution, interim or final, will be adopted by the British government without the Muslim League's approval and consent. It did not, however, accept the Viceroy's offer regarding the membership of the Executive Council, resolving later that month to request Linlithgow to reconsider his proposal and authorizing Jinnah to seek further information and clarification. Sikandar tried his best to persuade his committee colleagues to accept the Viceroy's august offer, threatening to withdraw from the League if Jinnah persisted in his obstinacy. Jinnah, however, was never moved by threats from any source, and Sikandar did not quit the League. Armed with his working committee's support, Jinnah informed the Viceroy that a prior condition to the League's willingness to join any expanded Executive Council or War Advisory Council was an understanding that, in the event of any other party, Congress, deciding later on to be associated, it should be allowed to do so on terms that may be approved of and consented to by the Muslim League. Linlithgow considered Jinnah's escalating demands obstructive to the war effort and felt that Jinnah wanted to become, in effect, Prime Minister, a goal the Viceroy had no intention whatever of furthering. Congress was eager to launch civil disobedience, and the only question Gandhi had to resolve was whether it should be a symbolic individual or mass movement. The individual variety towards which he was predisposed was, of course, easier to control and keep non-violent. On the eve of his 71st birthday, the Mahatma was understandably reluctant to lead another campaign that might provoke major violence. Individual Satyagraha was launched in mid-October. Gandhi selected his saintly ashram disciple, Vinoba Bhave, to court arrest first by openly speaking out against the war effort. Vinoba was arrested on October 17th and sentenced to 3 months in jail. Government ordered all newspapers to stop publishing statements against the war effort. Gandhi protested by suspending publication of his Harijan journal. The Mahatma next considered the possibility of a fast, prolonged or unto death, and wrote to warn the Viceroy of that possibility while waiting on God to find what is to be the case. He also tried to appeal directly to Hitler to stop the war, but the letter he wrote was never permitted to leave India. Nehru argued vigorously against a fast, insisting it was inopportune and offering to court jail himself. He was arrested on October 30th and tried for breaking British martial law early in November. Jawaharlal was found guilty as charged and sentenced to 4 years of rigorous imprisonment, most of it spent in his old cell at Dehradun. Jinnah took pains at this time to remind the British of how loyal Muslims had been and how worthy of partnership. He launched a threefold attack upon enemies within the government of India, militant Hindus and Muslims in Congress. Among the former he included Linlithgow himself, to whose face he was overheard saying, "You have double-crossed me." By then, Jinnah considered the viceroy wooden and antediluvian and had concluded that Linlithgow and his official coterie at Simla merely want our support on the assurance that we shall be remembered as loyal servants after the war and will even be given a bakshish. Hindu leaders of the Mahasabha wanted to treat Muslims, Jinnah argued, like Jews in Germany. As for Congress Muslims, Jinnah called them mere showboys. Early in February of 1941, Shah Nawaz Khan prepared a confidential memorandum for Jinnah on what is Pakistan, a demographic analysis of each province in which northwestern and northeastern Muslim zones of British India and some strategic advice about the Indian states. From this date, at least, it is clear that Jinnah knew it would be necessary to readjust the Punjab's territorial boundaries, and Shah Nawaz suggested excluding Ambala division, which was not only mostly Hindu and Sikh in population, but also a fiscal liability and not an asset. In the northeast, moreover, Jinnah was alerted to the following harsh realities. The Muslim population of Assam was only 31.8% of that province's total population, while the Burdwan division of Bengal was overwhelmingly Hindu, and the overall Muslim majority of Bengal totaled a scanty 54.8%. Shah Nawaz cleverly proposed excluding Burdwan division from Pakistan's eastern wing but retaining the large and rich region of Assam united to the rest of Bengal, thus raising the Muslim majority in the region as a whole to 57.9%. In this confidential memo, Shafi's shrewd son-in-law also recommended a third federation of Indian states since most princes like Muslims were anxious to maintain their integrity and sovereign rights. As for Hyderabad, however, he felt it was large and populous enough to merit fully independent status with direct political relations with the crown like Nepal. Jinnah was to rely heavily on this memo in the years of strenuous negotiations ahead. The annual session of the League was scheduled to start on April 12th of 1941 in Madras's People Park, where an estimated 100,000 Muslims gathered, filling the pandal to capacity, long before their Quaid-e-Azam reached the sweltering scene. When our train was a few hours from Madras, he got up and suddenly collapsed, Fatma recalled. I dashed to his side, kneeling on the floor, asking, Jinn, what is wrong? He smiled, a worn-out smile. I suddenly felt weak, exhausted. He put his hand on my shoulder, slowly lifted himself, and staggered to his berth. The train came to a halt, and thousands of enthusiastic admirers were on the platform shouting, Quaid-e-Azam Zindabad. I opened the door of our compartment slightly and pleaded, Don't shout, the Quaid is resting. He has a fever and is fatigued. Please get a doctor. Within minutes, a doctor arrived, examined him, and said, Sir, you have had a nervous breakdown. Nothing serious, but I would advise you not to move about for at least a week. Please stay in bed. We were soon in Madras. The Quaid was too weak to address the opening session, but on the following day, he insisted that he would deliver his presidential address. I advised him against it, but finding that he was adamant, begged him to make short speech. All right, I shall try to be brief, he said. He had no notes. Once he began, he went on speaking for over 2 hours. Ladies and gentlemen, in the first place, let me thank you and those who have made enquiries about my indisposition. I have received so many messages and calls that it is not possible for me to reply to them personally, but I hope you will accept my heartfelt thanks. Behind him on the glittering dais, decked in green silk and flanked by its Muslim League guards, sat the revered leader of South India's anti-Congress non-Brahman Justice Party, E.V. Ramaswamy Naikar, the Periyar great sage of the Dravidistan movement, and other Tamil Nadu luminaries, including Jinnah's old friend Sir A.P. Patro. Since the fall of the Mughal Empire, I think I am right in saying that Muslim India was never so well organized and so alive and so politically conscious as it is today. Jinnah kept one hand clutched in his pocket of his loose hanging white linen jacket as he spoke, bracing himself with the other bony fingered arm on the speaker's stand, determined not to smoke or to fall. We have established a flag of our own, a national flag of Muslim India. We have established a remarkable platform which displays and demonstrates a complete unity of the entire solid body of Muslim India. He spoke extempore in a faultless, subdued English accent, and his face, though rather skeletal, was brightened by the luminosity of his eyes. We have defined in the clearest language our goal about which Muslim India was groping in the dark, and the goal is Pakistan. That is our 5-year plan of the past. We have succeeded in raising the prestige and reputation of the League. Not only throughout this country, we have now reached the farthest corners of the world, and we are watched throughout the world. Now, what next? No people can ever succeed in anything that they desire unless they work for it and work hard for it. What is required now is that you should think, and I say this particularly to you, delegates of the All India Muslim League who have gathered here from all parts of India. We must now think and devise the program of a 5-year plan, and part of the 5-year plan should be how quickly and how best the departments of the national life of Muslim India may be built. He needed and wanted more brains, more bodies, platoons and brigades of wise, young and fearless followers to carry on, magnify, actualize his orders. For his own strength, his life's energy was flagging and failing him. He was clearly feeling the strain of speaking in that stuffed, humid, overheated pandal. But instead of quitting, he grit his teeth and forged ahead, drawing energy, it seemed, from the crowd's attention and palpable devotion. The fever had returned to plague his painfully thin body. Still, he would not abandon the podium or turn his back on the so huge and receptive an audience. He meandered over the political history of India since the war had started, returning again and again to his favorite subject, what the Congress wants. The Congress has taken up a position about which there is absolutely no doubt. I should like to ask any man with a grain of sense, do you really think that Gandhi, the supreme leader, commander and general of the Congress, had started this satyagraha merely for the purpose of getting liberty of speech? Don't you really feel that this is nothing but a weapon of coercion and blackmailing the British, who are in a tight corner, to surrender and concede the Congress demands? Then Jinnah concluded his Madras address with it. Real warning to the British government, because after all they are in possession of this land and the government of this subcontinent. Please stop your policy of appeasement towards those who are bent upon frustrating your war efforts and doing their best to oppose the prosecution of war and the defense of India at this critical moment. You are not loyal to those who are willing to stand by you and sincerely desire to support you. You desire to placate those who have the greatest nuisance value in the political and economic fields. If the government want the wholehearted cooperation of Muslim India, they must place their cards on the table. The great enthusiasm of that large gathering had served as a tonic, Fatma remembered. But only I knew that weakness, exhaustion, and fever would follow.